For 10 years, no one in Connecticut remembered Eleanor Briggs. Not her family, not her neighbors, not a single soul. But when she suddenly returned with millions in her name and a secret she refused to tell, everyone wanted to know one thing: how does a forgotten old woman vanish and come back richer than the people who abandoned her? For 10 years, no one in Connecticut remembered Eleanor Briggs. Not her family, not her neighbors, and certainly not the people who once claimed they would never abandon her. 10 years is a long time to forget a woman who had spent most of her life caring for others, driving neighbors to doctor appointments, baking pies for community fundraisers, watching her sister's children when no one else had time. Yet when she suddenly disappeared, not a single phone rang in search of her. No police report was filed, no missing person posters were printed, and no one bothered to knock on the door of the tiny cottage she once lived in. The house simply sat there, silent and lonely, like it had been waiting for someone, anyone, to remember the woman who used to bring it to life. Grass grew knee-high in the yard, shingles peeled off the roof, and the mailbox overflowed with years of forgotten letters, each one a reminder of how completely Eleanor had slipped from everyone's mind. And then, just as quietly as she had vanished, she returned. She walked into town on a cold, sharp morning in late October, the kind where the air feels thin and the sky turns a pale silver that makes everything look washed out. The locals at the bakery were the first to see her. They watched through the fogged-up window as an elderly woman in a long gray coat and a faded wool scarf stepped off the bus, gripping a wooden cane polished from years of use. At first they assumed she was just another visitor passing through the small Connecticut town. Tourists sometimes came to see the fall leaves, but then someone recognized the tilt of her chin, the careful way she looked at buildings like they were long-lost friends, and the silver clip still holding back her hair the same way it had a decade ago. One by one, people inside the bakery fell silent, their chatter fading as confusion spread across their faces. Eleanor Briggs, the woman they hadn't spoken to in 10 years. The woman they had so conveniently forgotten. But it wasn't just her unexpected return that sent a ripple of shock through the town. It was what she carried with her. When she stepped into the bank later that afternoon to withdraw the contents of an account no one knew she had, the teller froze. The numbers on the screen didn't make sense. Eleanor Briggs, a woman who once struggled to pay her heating bills, now had an account filled with millions. Not thousands, not a small inheritance. Millions. Enough to buy half the street she grew up on, enough to make people whisper, enough to make people suspicious. People gathered outside the bank windows pretending to check their phones or tie their shoes, but in reality, they were staring at her. They watched the subtle confidence in her posture, the calm expression in her eyes, the faint, almost unreadable smile that played on her lips as she signed forms with a steady hand. It wasn't the smile they remembered. Warm, gentle, and eager to please. This smile was different, sharper, detached, like she knew something they didn't, like she had lived through something no one in that town could imagine. By evening, rumors spread faster than the wind that shook the autumn trees. Some said she had married a wealthy man in secret. Others whispered about an old family fortune she had somehow found. A few claimed she had been living in another country, working for people with money and power. And then there were the darker theories, that she had taken revenge on those who wronged her, that she had stumbled upon something dangerous, that she had come back not to reconnect, but to settle something. Eleanor didn't explain. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even acknowledge the swirling questions. She simply walked down Main Street with her cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement, her steps slow but deliberate. With every movement, it was as if she was counting the faces she once knew, the neighbors who ignored her calls, the relatives who stopped visiting when she needed them the most, the townspeople who had pretended not to notice her fading health before she disappeared. That night, long after the sun dipped behind the hills and the streetlights flickered on, Eleanor quietly left the small rented room she had checked into. She didn't pack much, just a worn leather notebook and a thin envelope she kept pressed to her chest. Before stepping into the darkness, she placed a single folded note on the bedside table. No signature, no explanation, just a few handwritten words and one name circled at the bottom, a name that would change everything for the people who once forgot her. The next morning, when the room was found empty, the first question on everyone's lips wasn't, "Where did she go?" But something far more unsettling. How does a woman forgotten for a decade return with millions? And a look in her eyes that says she remembers every single person who abandoned her. Eleanor simply smiled, a smile people said didn't look the same, and asked for a list of every person who once promised they'd never leave her. It was a small request, spoken so softly that the young bank teller almost missed it. But something in Eleanor's voice stopped her. It wasn't loud, but it carried a firmness, a slow-burning authority that didn't match the fragile elderly woman standing before her. The teller hesitated, glancing toward her manager, unsure if she should fulfill such a strange request. And yet when she looked again into Eleanor's eyes, sharp, observant, and carrying a weight 10 years in the making, she found herself unable to refuse. She handed Eleanor a notepad, expecting her to write down maybe 2 or 3 names, a few old acquaintances at most. But Eleanor wrote with a level of certainty that unsettled the room. Her hand didn't shake, she didn't pause to remember. Each name flowed as if she had been rehearsing them for years, each stroke of the pen deliberate, almost surgical. These weren't just names, they were reminders, they were debts. She folded the paper, placed it gently into her coat pocket, and exited the bank with the same faint smile. Those who saw her walk past said she moved differently now. Slower, yes, but with a precise, measured grace, like every step had meaning. She didn't glance at the familiar houses lining the street or the stores where she once spent lonely afternoons. Instead, she headed straight toward the old town square, stopping only when she reached the cracked stone fountain at its center. She stood there for several minutes, staring at the water with an expression that no one could fully read. Some said she looked heartbroken. Others swore they saw something else, determination maybe, or the kind of quiet fury people develop after a decade of being forgotten. Later that night, the woman running the small bed and breakfast where Eleanor was staying noticed the door to her room slightly ajar. She knocked, waited, then pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The room was spotless, the bed neatly made, the lamp still glowing faintly in the corner. But Eleanor was gone. No bags, no coat, no cane. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the walls. On the bedside table, beneath the soft yellow light of the lamp, lay a single folded note. The innkeeper picked it up with trembling fingers, expecting a polite message or a thank you. But when she opened it, she froze. It wasn't a letter, it was a list of names. Some she recognized, some belonged to people who lived just down the street, and one name, circled, underlined twice, belonged to someone who hadn't spoken Eleanor's name in almost a decade. The ink was fresh, pressed deeply into the paper as if written with intention, emotion, or perhaps something darker. The innkeeper felt a cold shiver crawl across her shoulders. She placed the paper back where she found it, too frightened to keep holding it, and backed out of the room without turning off the light. By morning, news spread that Eleanor had vanished again, hours after returning. People whispered on sidewalks, exchanged nervous looks in grocery store aisles, checked locks twice before going to bed. And as the story traveled, so did one chilling detail. The names circled on that note belonged to the one person who had hurt Eleanor the most, the person who had forgotten her first, and most completely. Authorities were called, but when they searched Margaret's room, they found no intruder. Only a small velvet pouch resting neatly on her pillow, as if placed there by someone who knew exactly how to unsettle her. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her breath trapped somewhere between her chest and her throat. She didn't want to step closer, didn't want to touch anything, didn't want to acknowledge the truth she already knew. Deep inside, Eleanor had been there, in her home, in her bedroom, inches from where she slept. The police officer, a young man with a nervous habit of clearing his throat, picked up the pouch with gloved hands and turned it over gently. "Ma'am," he said, voice softer now, "does this belong to you?" Margaret shook her head quickly. "No," she whispered. "It's hers." "Whose?" She hesitated, then finally said the name she had avoided for a decade. "My sister." When the officer loosened the string and opened the pouch, Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Inside was a gold locket, old, delicate, polished by years of being held close. Eleanor's locket. She used to wear it every day, touching it absent-mindedly whenever she talked, as if it gave her comfort. Margaret remembered the tiny click of that locket opening, the photo inside. A faded but precious picture of the two sisters, younger, smiling, arms wrapped around each other before life and resentment pulled them apart. But when the officer snapped it open now, the original picture was gone. In its place was a new photograph, sharp, recent, chilling. Eleanor stood in front of a large mansion Margaret had never seen before, wearing clothes far too expensive for the woman who once struggled to afford groceries. Her back was straight, her chin lifted, her eyes were colder, sharper, more alive than Margaret remembered, and in her hand, held casually like a message, was a folded newspaper. The date printed on it was from 2 days ago. The officer exchanged a quick, uneasy look with his partner. "This isn't an old photo," he murmured. "Your sister, she's been somewhere recently. Margar." Ed pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, trying to swallow the rising wave of panic. "But where? She doesn't have friends. She never traveled. She never had that much money. The officer cut her off gently. "Someone does, ma'am. Whoever owns that mansion certainly does." He pointed to the mansion gates behind Eleanor in the photo. A crest was carved into the iron, a complex symbol of vines, a shield, and what looked like a serpent curled around a letter. The officers photographed the crest and sent it to the station for analysis. One of them muttered, "That's old money. Serious old money. Could be a family estate. If we can figure out which family." Margaret sank onto the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the locket on the officer's glove. Every memory of Eleanor she tried to bury began resurfacing all at once. Her soft laugh, her quiet patience, the way she always apologized even when she wasn't wrong. But then came the other memories, the clinginess, the guilt trips, the way she had depended so heavily on Margaret after their parents died. Margaret had felt suffocated, trapped, so when the nursing home suggested keeping Eleanor temporarily for evaluation, Margaret agreed. Then she visited less, then not at all. Then her life moved forward while Eleanor's froze. And now Eleanor had returned with the cold smile of someone who had counted every minute of abandonment. Just as Margaret's breath began to steady, her phone buzzed. Everyone in the small room snapped their heads toward the sound. Her hands shook as she reached for it, expecting maybe a friend or a family member asking about the police cars outside. But the message wasn't from anyone she knew. It was from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a single sentence: "If you want to know where I was, don't call the police. Come alone." Margaret's heart slammed. She knows the P. "Elise are here," she whispered. "She's watching me." The officers didn't dismiss the idea. They began searching the house more thoroughly, checking doors, windows, the backyard, but found nothing out of place. No signs of forced entry, no footprints besides the ones they had already seen earlier, the muddy tracks that led from the back door straight into her bedroom and ended where the pouch had been placed. But Margaret's mind was racing past what the officers were doing. The message wasn't a threat, and that terrified her more. It felt like an invitation, a test. Eleanor wanted to talk to her, and wanted her alone. Why? To confront her? To punish her? To ask why she had abandoned her? Or worse, to show her something? When the officers finally left, promising to increase patrols near the house, Margaret sat alone in her dimly lit living room, phone still glowing in her hand. She read the message over and over until the words blurred. She tried texting back, "Who is this? Eleanor, is it you?" But no reply came, just silence. Deep, heavy, waiting silence. She looked again at the photo inside the locket, at the mansion behind Eleanor. That crest, that mansion, that strange confidence in her sister's eyes. Something was deeply wrong, or deeply hidden, or maybe both. Eleanor had money now, connections, access to places Margaret never knew existed, and she had left that locket, her most treasured possession, behind for Margaret to find, not stolen, not misplaced, left. Intentionally, as the night thickened around her house, Margaret felt the pressure of Eleanor's absence more than the presence of anyone around. She could almost feel her sister's eyes watching from the shadows outside, waiting to see if she would follow the instruction, waiting to see if Margaret still cared enough to come find her. Finally, unable to bear the weight any longer, she whispered into the still air. "Where are you, Ellie? And what have you become?" She didn't know it yet, but Eleanor was already closer than she thought. Watching, planning, waiting for her sister's next move, and preparing the truth she would reveal only if Margaret dared to meet her alone. Margaret followed the pinned location deep into the old Connecticut woods, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned bone white. The road grew thinner the farther she drove, narrowing from asphalt to gravel, then from gravel to a dirt path swallowed by towering pines. Her headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating branches that clawed at the car as though warning her to turn back. The forest felt unnaturally silent. No crickets, no rustling animals, no wind. Just the hum of the engine and the echo of her own breath, shallow and unsteady. She hadn't been out here since she was 16, when she and Eleanor used to sneak away from home to escape their suffocating relatives. Those were the last years when they were close, before adulthood, resentment, and distance pushed them towards separate lives. After nearly 30 minutes of driving deeper into the woods than she thought possible, her GPS flickered out. The screen froze on the location pin, then blinked twice before turning black. Margaret's heart lurched. She tapped the screen, hoping it was just a glitch, but the device remained dead. She considered turning back for a moment, but the message echoed in her mind. Come alone. Eleanor had chosen this place for a reason, and Margaret knew she couldn't walk away now. Not after the locket, not after the footprints in her home, not after 10 years of silence. A few minutes later, the trees parted just enough for her headlights to reveal a structure hidden behind a curtain of vines and shadow. She slammed the brakes, her breath hitched. There it was, the mansion from the photograph. T rose out of the forest like a relic buried in time, massive, imposing, with stone walls weathered by age and neglect. Ivy crept across the pillars like dark veins, and the iron gates stood open just as they had in the photo, their crest glowing faintly under the weak moonlight. Margaret's stomach twisted. The place looked abandoned, yet every window glowed with soft amber light, casting long, trembling silhouettes across the grass. Someone was inside, someone waiting. She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tighter around her body as the cold night air bit at her skin. The silence was heavier here, almost suffocating, as though the entire forest held its breath. Her footsteps crunched against the gravel path leading to the entrance. For a moment she hesitated at the gates, trailing her fingers along the crest carved into the iron. A twisting serpent coiled around a shield. Something about it felt ancient, purposeful, almost ceremonial. As she touched it, a faint vibration pulsed through the metal. She froze. Was that movement? Or just her nerves spiraling? Shaking the thought off, she pushed forward toward the mansion doors. The entrance stood wide open, just like in the picture, as if welcoming her or luring her with deliberate intent. She stepped inside. Warm air washed over her immediately. It didn't make sense. The mansion looked abandoned from the outside, but from the moment she crossed the threshold, everything changed. The interior glowed with polished chandeliers, their crystals refracting golden light across spotless marble floors. Portraits lined the walls, massive paintings in ornate frames, each one depicting Eleanor at different ages, but in a style that made no sense. These weren't old pictures, they were new clothes, new hairstyles, new expressions. Eleanor smiling faintly in one, glaring with cold intensity in another, gazing sideways in a third, as though watching someone outside the frame. But the strangest part wasn't her presence in the portraits. It was the way she looked in them. She wasn't frail, she wasn't aging. She wasn't the Eleanor who used to shuffle around the kitchen in worn slippers and oversized sweaters. This Eleanor looked powerful, young, alert, almost regal, as though she had stepped into a new world and left her old self behind. Margaret moved deeper into the mansion, each step echoing loudly despite the thick carpets. Her throat tightened. This was no ordinary house. This was a curated gallery of Eleanor's life, but not the life Margaret knew. A voice echoed faintly from somewhere upstairs. "Took you long enough." Margaret gasped. Eleanor. She hadn't heard her voice in 10 years, yet she recognized it instantly. Except, it sounded different now. Stronger, clearer, steady in a way Eleanor's voice had never been. Margaret climbed the staircase, gripping the banister with trembling fingers. Halfway up, a draft brushed against her, carrying a faint scent she remembered. lavender soap, the kind Eleanor always used. Her vision blurred with the sting of unexpected emotion. Memories flooded her mind. Eleanor brushing her hair before school, Eleanor saving her last cookie, Eleanor waiting by the window every evening just to see her come home. And then the darker memories. The pleading phone calls Margaret ignored, the nursing home she stopped visiting after a few weeks, the envelope of letters she shoved into a drawer unopened. At the top of the stairs, Margaret found a long hallway lined with doors. One of them, at the far end, stood slightly ajar, light spilling out. Heart hammering, she approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she pushed the door open, her breath caught in her throat. Eleanor sat in a high-backed velvet chair, dressed in a deep burgundy coat that looked like it belonged to someone of wealth and power. Her hair, once thin and graying, was neatly pinned back and fuller, her posture straight, her eyes sharp. She did not look fragile. She did not look abandoned. She did not look like someone who had been forgotten. She looked like a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her past and come back to collect the pieces she had left behind. "Ellie," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. What is this place?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the ledger book resting beside her, its pages filled with intricate handwriting, numbers, and unfamiliar symbols. Margaret strained to read the text but only caught fragments. Names, places, transactions, dates stretching back decades. Finally, Eleanor stood, walking slowly toward her sister, her cane tapped softly against the floor, more ceremonial than supportive now. 10 years, Eleanor said calmly, 10 years without a word, 10 years without a visit, 10 years without a single moment where you wondered whether I was dead or alive. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Eleanor, Don't," Eleanor cut in quietly, her tone neither angry nor gentle, just resolute. "Excuses won't change anything." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. "I disappeared because people made me feel invisible. And during those 10 years, I found things no one wanted me to find." She gestured to the walls around them, the portraits, the wealth, the secrets painted into every corner of the mansion. "Do you know whose house this was?" Eleanor asked. Margaret shook her head hesitantly. "This," Eleanor said softly, "belonged to the Briggs family. Our father's lineage, the part of our heritage no one told us about, the part with money, influence, power, and enemies." Margaret's eyes widened. "Our father?" she whispered. "But he never had money. That's what everyone wanted us to believe," Eleanor replied. She moved to the window, staring into the dark woods outside. "When I was taken to the nursing home, I found letters, old letters, from people he once knew, people who owed him, people who feared him." She turned back. "I followed those threads. I found the records. I found the vaults. I found the debtors." Margaret's breath caught. "Eleanor, what have you done?" "What I had to," Eleanor said. "What no one else would do for me." There was a long, heavy silence. Then Eleanor's gaze hardened. "Now," she whispered, "I'm deciding who deserves to share what I found, and who helped me vanish in the first place." Margaret's knees weakened. "And what about me?" she whispered. Eleanor closed the ledger slowly, the room darkening as the candlelight flickered. "That," she said, her voice low and unreadable, "depends on what you tell me before the others arrive.